Sometimes people will try to call me a neckbeard, and to which my only real thought is, well, no shit, Sherlock. Wow, that is a terrible way to open up a video. And that's why I've come from the future to interrupt myself. So, when I started this video, I had no idea where it was going to take me. And now that everything has come together and the entire process is now in the rearview mirror for me, oh, there are some things that I should say. Such as the fact that we are about to take on some incredibly heavy topics in this video. Which makes a lot of sense given that I'm talking about the Sandman comic books as well as the Netflix adaptation of the comic books, and both forms of media wind up taking on some incredibly heavy topics. So here is the general content warning. In the video up ahead, we are going to make mention of the topics of death and dying, murder, sexual assault, nightmares, as well as real-life world happenings taking place in the world right now at the time of my filming this, or some things that have happened in the past. And since this video is a longer one, I figured that I would just go ahead and get it out of the way right away by letting you know what we're going to wind up talking about. The best way I could think about doing this was viewing this video either as a story or a series of stories, because it's not inaccurate to make the suggestion that this is actually just multiple videos stacked on top of one another. So now, each segment has its own chapter title. The first one is the preface, which is what we're doing now, and then we have the intro, which is what I interrupted. In Chapter 1, we have What is Sandman, where I talk about the comic books, the character of Dream of the Endless, as well as the Netflix adaptation. Then Chapter 2, we have Meta-narratives are cool, because I talk about how the story of Sandman, particularly in the comic books, establishes a meta-narrative, and then I go on to explain a little bit about what meta-narratives are, other times that they wind up being used, and how they can be used for incredibly cool effects. Then Chapter 3, we have the death of media literacy in occult spaces. Now, here's the thing that you need to know about me. I myself am a witch, a magician, and an all-around, I do magic. I love that shit. And as a result of this, I have spent more time than I'd like to admit in and out of online occult spaces. And courtesy of the greater conglomerate that we can refer to as Witch Talk, I noticed that there is a correlation between the way that we interpret myth and the death of media literacy. So, in that chapter, I wind up talking about the Hades and Persephone marriage story to explain why meta-narratives and actual media literacy when interpreting and talking about myth is not just important, but absolutely necessary. Chapter 4, we have taking myths literally as bad, okay? You'll see what I'm talking about when we get there. In Chapter 5, we have what dreams are, what they do, and what they are not. Where for the majority of that segment, chapter, I wind up using the issues in the comic as well as the namesakes in the TV show, 24/7 and A Hope in Hell, to sort of pick that apart and interpret it to explain what dreams are, what they do, and what they are not. Chapter 6 is titled, Why I Give a Shit, where I spend some time just sort of breaking character to talk about myself and why I care so much about this particular series of topics where I'm using Sandman as the jumping point for all of it. And I do this speaking as a comic book enthusiast, as a story writer myself, and as a magician, a witch, somebody who does magic. Then we come back for 3 chapters that aren't as clearly segmented as the others were previously, but in the best of my ability, I was able to title those chapters as Black Mirrors and Hypnagogia, Rorschachs and Divination, and then dream and the collective unconscious. In this final 3-part portion of the video, I start off by talking about a dream that I myself had that left me with more questions than answers. Then from that point, I used the Sandman comics as a series of jumping points to talk about Black Mirrors that then leads me into shadow work and a bunch of other Jungian psychology. And honestly, at this point, if I say much more, I'm going to give the whole damn plot away. Then with the way that the video actually ends was a lot of fun for me to go about doing, but I'm going to leave that for the surprise at the end. All in all, I know that this video is a much longer one compared to most of my content, but if you are familiar with my content that I do here, and you have enjoyed some of my longer videos, I have no reason to believe that you're not going to like this one. Or if you just so happen to like the Sandman comics, the Sandman TV show, mythology, if you yourself are pagan, if you like hearing people talk about literature in general or media literacy, or if you just like occultism or the dark, spooky, mystical things, you're probably going to like this one. That being said, I'm going to get the hell out of here, and let's get back to the video. See you on the other side. Sometimes people will try to call me a neckbeard, and to which my only real thought is, well, no shit, Sherlock. And I've come to realize that to them they think they're insulting me, and to me it seems like a bit of an observation. And I say this about myself, one, for a little bit of lampshading, and two, it seems to be just true. I am a chubby, nerdy NB who listens to heavy metal, practices magic, and my entire social media presence with the name Just Jaquel is namesake with a D&D character that I created. What can I say to defend myself? Absolutely nothing. It is what it is. And this is all preface to today's video, which is an excuse to talk about Sandman, the DC comic. More so, I want to talk about Sandman as an excuse to talk about a whole bunch of other things that I personally find to be interesting. Starting with the author of the Sandman character, Neil Gaiman, who has written a whole bunch of different things. Some you might be familiar with, such as Stardust, Neverwhere, American Gods, Coraline, just to name a few. In much of Neil Gaiman's most notable and popular works, we start off in the normal world and through a series of events get either introduced to or thrust into some kind of magical world, a severe departure from the things that we know and are comfortable with in our everyday lives. In Stardust, the main character literally jumps over a ledge, over onto another side, and starts to partake in a magical world. In Neverwhere, the main character that we follow around is living a very drab, bland, mundane, normal life, and then starts to realize that there is a magical world that exists right under everybody's nose. And in Coraline moves in with her parents into a new place just to find out that it's connected to a completely different other world. Now, Sandman strikes me as a little bit different, because instead of the normal mundane world going over into a magical world, people in the mundane world bring the magical into the mundane. And as a result of this, we start seeing the impact of what happens when a magical order led by Magus Burgess, intending to capture death itself, they wind up instead capturing Dream, the Sandman. And we start seeing the impact of how the magical being trapped and contained starts to affect the world around us in the mundane. Now, in this video, I don't want to partake in a rehashing of the plot, nor do I want to spot the differences between the Netflix adaptation and the comic book, and in doing that, I'm probably going to wind up referring to both. Because in whichever interpretation we're talking about, Lord Morpheus is the King of Dreams, the Prince of Stories, and through either medium, whether it be on screen or in comics, we still wind up having the interesting exploration of the question, what exactly are dreams? And using Sandman as the vehicle to pose this question, I myself intend to use this video that I'm making here as an exploration of what exactly that question is, via some sort of quasi-philosophical musings or some occult and magical ideation. I really want to take the time to explore this because I think the implications are incredibly cool. For the next part of the video, I think I want to start off with the comic. Oh, hang on, I'm talking to a mirror. I want to start off with the comic because I think it is in the comic more so than in the Netflix series that we really get a look at what Neil Gaiman tried to do by making a character who deliberately pokes at the idea, the pun, the double entendre of what dreams are. Almost right away in the comics, whether we realize it or not upon first read, we are introduced to characters that already existed in previous stories, such as Lord Morpheus's librarian of sorts, Lucian, who is from a discontinued Golden Age DC horror series. We're also introduced to the characters of Cain and Abel, who, although many of us are familiar with them from the Bible, they are also specifically the interpretations of Cain and Abel that were in one of Alan Moore's comics when he was writing Swamp Thing. And because the Sandman comics are a part of the DC Comics universe, we are introduced to some interesting characters from the overall DC Comics universe. That's redundant, but I'm leaving it in. Now, there already was a pre-existing DC superhero referred to as Sandman, of whom this Lord Morpheus was supposed to be the reboot of, but instead of entirely retconning the character, we see the character referred to when Lord Morpheus is captured by Magus Burgess and the Order of Secret Mysteries that during this sleeping sickness pandemic of sorts, the character of Sandman from the earlier iterations of the DC universe now is inspired to start taking up the mantle of Sandman. And in this fun little way, we now retroactively see that the Sandman has always been a part of the DC Comics universe. And the reason that he was never introduced previously as Lord Morpheus is because he was captured and in containment. And once Lord Morpheus is freed from his capture, he then goes on a series of journeys to reclaim some of these treasures, sacred, there was a word trying to come out there, special magical items that he now has to go out and retrieve and do a little bit of sleuthing to figure out what happened to them. And that is when we are now being introduced to several different superheroes from the DC universe. We encounter Mr. Miracle and Martian Manhunter, who are a part of the Justice League of America. And when he interacts with them and is confronted by Martian Manhunter, this Martian drops and bows and starts to worship him like he's a god, which already establishes his pre-existing continuity that was present in the universe whether we were aware of it or not. We also get a glimpse into Arkham Asylum, where the Scarecrow and John Dee are being held. John Dee being a character who is already an established villain in the DC Comics universe, of whom I forget what his villain name is, so I'll put it up on screen somewhere. There you go. And the reason that we are introduced to these characters is because John Dee knows the location of the ruby that rightfully belongs to Lord Morpheus that Lord Morpheus is trying to find. And courtesy of the inclusion of this villain, who just so happens to wind up in possession of the Dream Ruby, we get one of the most horrifying and gruesome issues of the comic that then is adapted into the most horrifying and gruesome episodes of the Netflix series. Now, I hope I haven't lost too many so far, because I understand that I am attempting to cater to several different demographics, of whom don't always overlap, making this video incredibly niche. But there's a point to expositing all of the comic book information, and that point is this character, Sandman, Lord Morpheus, King of Dreams, Prince of Stories. Already, through the comic, we are seeing one character interact with characters that others have created. which posits this idea that stories are dreams. By the fact that the Sandman, Lord Morpheus, is interacting with the characters from other stories, although they are contained within the same universe, we are able to establish a meta-narrative, or a line of narrative that sort of bridges the line between the audience and the narrative of the story. And with this meta-narrative, the fourth wall can remain intact while at the same time giving us an opportunity to establish some kind of commentary. This meta-narrative that is established by stories interacting with stories is even furthered later in the comic when, after Dream has retrieved all of the items he was looking for and encounters his sister, Death. This brings us further into the lore and the world of Dream of the Endless, because it's not until then that the title of the Endless means something, because now there are more like him, and by the time that he spends with his sister, aiding her in her job, bridging people over after they pass on into the Sunless Lands, or that universe's afterlife, we see that these characters and characters like them have been traversing the DC Comics universe for some time, and have always been there whether we were aware of them or not. We see this even further in a sort of flashback set of sequences where we look further back in time when Death and Dream were in a pub in the 14th century and encountered a gentleman by the name of Hob Gadlin. That's what it was, right?
Yep, Hob.
It is in this 14th century tavern that Hob Gadlin proclaims that the only reason that people die is because everybody's doing it, so he's not gonna do it. And it just so happens that Death and Dream are in the background listening to this conversation, and Death is able to grant this to him. Alongside that, there is a gentleman by the name of Bill Shaxberg, who says that he wants to create stories that will live long after him. As it turns out, this is William Shakespeare. Now that Hob Gadlin has been granted effective immortality, he and Dream meet up at the same tavern every 100 years to chit-chat and catch up and prove Dream wrong that people just want to live sometimes and continue living, and to treat all humans if they are the same is unfair. With this, we see that they have always been around, interacting with people that are even a part of our world. Enter Shakespeare, where later on in the series we have a whole issue dedicated to this wager that Dream made with William Shakespeare. In this panel here, we see Dream talking to Bill Shaxberg, where Dream approaches him and says, "I heard your talk, Will. Will you write great plays, create new dreams to spur the minds of men? Is that your will?" To which he says, "It is." "Then let us talk." This gets reconvened later in the comic series, and we revisit William Shakespeare as he is putting on a production of his play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. A play where at the end of it, it posits the idea that it could have all just been a dream. This is a play that many people are familiar with, so by establishing William Shakespeare in this comics universe and talking about a play that William Shakespeare performed and put on and wrote and produced, a play that we are familiar with in our world, that sort of draws the line between our world and the comic world, establishing this meta-narrative, where then they get to explore the idea of what it costs to spur the minds of other men, what it takes to actually get the job done. But also, what if the characters in the play were actually there to watch the play be performed? Now, in this comic book, based on The Lord of Dreams, the characters of a story that we are familiar with in our real world are now interacting with Dream, watching the play that was put on about them. Characters like Oberon and Titania and Puck are now giving their own commentary on the play that was made about them, whether Shakespeare knew it or not. Courtesy of this type of meta-narrative, we are able to provide commentary on the comic book itself, on the real-life history of William Shakespeare, and also comprehend how William Shakespeare fits into the DC universe. There are other types of media where this meta-narrative winds up being established in surprisingly effective ways. And my example is Cabin in the Woods. Cabin in the Woods is sort of a satirical look at the stereotypical slasher horror, where in the movie there is a group of teenagers that are going out to a cabin in the woods. What they don't know, and what the audience knows, is that the horrors that they are about to unleash upon themselves is all orchestrated by some sort of mysterious agency that is making sure that real-life things happen, where all of the horror tropes wind up playing out the way that they're supposed to. This film goes out of its way to make sure that the characters are fitting the tropes and matching the beats of your classic 80s slasher horror films, a la Friday the 13th and Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, where it taps into a social zeitgeist where it cautioned teens away from doing drugs and having premarital sex. Now in, when was this come out? 2011. Some of those tropes are outdated, and by establishing a narrative where the events that the teens are suffering are orchestrated by some sort of spooky, mysterious agency, we're able to poke fun at these tropes, and we're able to see how faulty they are, while the movie satirizes itself and pokes fun at itself, because an effective meta-narrative has been established. Now, although Cabin in the Woods goes out of its way to make fun of and poke fun at and satirize the popular tropes that, for whatever reason, we still clamor to in order to get a cheap thrill from the safety of our theater seats or our couches at home, this isn't the only reason for a meta-narrative to be established. It could be to provoke thought, provoke emotion, take something that we're all familiar with and provide commentary, help people change their perspective and their perception on something. And that's really what a lot of Sandman does. Now, for those of you who are still here and still don't have a working understanding of who and what Dream is, in the continuity of the DC Comics production, Dream of the Endless is one of 7 different siblings who are anthropomorphic concepts embodied into a humanoid form. They exist on this planet, on other planets. They are literally these concepts embodied. And not only do they embody these concepts, they help manage and govern the experiences that we have as a collective in our societies, on our planets, and in other solar systems entirely. The entire list of the Endless are dream, death, despair, desire, destruction, delirium, and destiny. Did I miss any?
No.
My significant other is off screen over here and knows this series far better than I do, which is why I keep deferring to them. And now I get to talk about the death of media literacy in occult spaces. And before you get too apprehensive, just remember, this is not where we spill the tea, but it is where we sip the coffee. Now, before I get too carried away, let's set this up by utilizing the Sandman comic. The character's name is Dream, but he's referred to by many different names, such as Sandman or Lord Morpheus. Now, in continuity, the reason that he is referred to as Lord Morpheus is because he's literally the Greek god Morpheus. Not in real life, but in the story. By inserting Morpheus as the Greek god Morpheus, we get to implement some of this meta-narrative over the Greek myths. The one that he's directly involved in places him as the father of Orpheus, but we also sort of get a glimpse of some of the other Greek deities. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the story of Orpheus in Greek myth, it generally goes something like this. Orpheus was a demigod who wound up marrying a nymph, and this nymph was named Eurydice. Eurydice winds up perishing shortly after or on their wedding night. Fraught with grief and peril, Orpheus, being a demigod, finds a way to enter into the underworld to try and find a way to convince the king and queen, Hades and Persephone, to allow him to bring Eurydice back. After a harrowing journey through the underworld, he finally arrives before the king and queen and tells a story in the form of a song. And with this song, he is able to move King Hades so deeply that he does the impossible and gets King Hades to shed a tear. And in return, he tells Orpheus, you may take Eurydice back with you, but if on the way up you look back to see her, she will vanish and return to my kingdom. And they are reaching almost so close when he looks back to check on her. Right as the sunlight hits them, they vanish. This story is also the basis of the Orphic tradition, where we have the Orphic hymns that are supposed to be a song to the gods. Each hymn is a song to sing the praise of each of the gods that are a part of the Orphic tradition. Now, in most resources that we find on the parentage of Orpheus, it will suggest that in the real world, Apollo, the god of song and poetry, is the divine father of Orpheus, which is also how he winds up with his lyre, where he can play the song that moves Hades to tears. However, in this continuity, this fictional comic book storyline, it makes just as much sense to place Morpheus, the god of dreams and prince of stories, as the father of Orpheus, because it is, although in a song form, a story that he tells to King Hades that moves him to tears. Now, courtesy of Wonder Woman, we already had the Greek pantheon as an existing playable character list in the DC Comics continuity, which means it wasn't that difficult to bring them back in the story for Sandman to explain why he's referred to as Morpheus, and also to have some of these gods and demigods be part of the storytelling of Sandman. However, by doing this, Sandman, Lord Morpheus, now gets to be used sort of as a vehicle for meta-narrative to provide commentary on the way that we receive these gods. And oh boy, where do I even start? Now, I think it's safe to assume that in real-world pagan settings, the god of dreams, Morpheus, isn't one and the same as this Sandman, nor are the gods in the comics represented the same one-to-one as they are in the real world. However, by introducing them in this way, we get to reconsider the idea of the gods being either the product of stories or myth simply being stories about the gods. Now, as much as I myself like to believe in the very real existence of pagan deities that get to interact with us in some anthropomorphic yet intangible and spiritual way, I still have to have my own disbelief suspended, because if we're going to take the myths literal at face value, then I myself have to consider and believe the idea that Hecate turned somebody into a polecat or something akin to a weasel and basically made that person her pet, her familiar of sorts. Also, that Zeus turned into a swan to impregnate a mortal woman. This is why I think it's important to reconsider that some of the myths are simply stories about the gods, where the gods that were worshipped in that time and place are now the characters that move the plot along. And yet, there are plenty of people in online spaces who will go ahead and say, no, these things literally happened, and defend the character of certain deities, or use the myth as a condemnation of certain deities in order to justify a particular point in which they are trying to convey. Now, I'm going to bring up quite possibly one of the touchiest possible examples, which is the Hades and Persephone marriage story. When we're putting this story into context, even though it is now the substance and the source of many current fiction novels and comics, because a lot of people would love to single out Lower Olympus, and even though Rachel Smythe's creation is one of the most popular, that's not the only one that takes liberties with the story in order to make an entirely new story altogether. The Hades and Persephone marriage story is a part of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, of which Demeter is the main character, and the marriage between Hades and Persephone is the conflict. In this story, Persephone is abducted and goes missing. Demeter doesn't know what's going on, and then goes out of her way to figure out what happened to her child. In the process, she winds up running into Hecate, who informs her that Hades had abducted her and taken her to the underworld to be his queen. And at some point, they wind up talking to Helios, who is literally the sun, who could further convey the actual events of what took place. As the story goes on, it is revealed that Hades asked Zeus for Persephone's hand in marriage. Zeus, being Persephone's father, said yes, and that was all the consent that was needed. Not only is this the way that the custom had already been set forth in regards to bridal abductions and arranged royal marriages, it was a ruling set forth by Zeus, the king of the gods. So there wasn't much that Demeter could do to change it at all. So in her grief, she goes off in disguise as a human to entertain herself with the mortal world, trying to distract herself, winds up taking care of a human child, tries throwing him into a fire because this is how you could turn a human into a god somehow. And when the mother of the child confronts her, she says, "I am Demeter, and I am grieving." The child, in most interpretations, is saved, but this also makes Demeter go, you know what, there is something I can do. I can refuse to do my job. Because Demeter is the goddess of the harvest and crops and grains and the growth of agriculture. And she chooses to starve everybody. After some time, this officially gets the attention of Zeus, finally, who sends Hermes to go figure out what the hell is going on. And Hermes goes back to say, hey, here's what's going on. So Zeus is like, ooh, we need to do something about this. So Hermes then goes all the way to the underworld in order to check on Hades and Persephone. And now this is where some interpretations and some translations wind up differing. Either Persephone is not digging the situation or seems utterly content and not really one way or another on her throne next to her king. And this is when Hermes says, hey, your dad sent me. Fast forward a little bit, after some conversation, Demeter says the only way that I am going to start allowing the crops to grow again is if I get my daughter back. So Zeus comes up with a way so she can get her daughter back, and it's a compromise. Persephone is to return to the surface world during the spring, and then return to the underworld when the crops are being harvested, which means that she is back in the underworld doing her queenly duties for 1/3 of the year, not 1/2 of the year. And this is how Zeus was able to change his mind, and Demeter got her daughter back. Now, on one hand, we can take a more academic approach and consider this as a story where an ancient religion utilized their gods as a way to explain how the seasons change. On the other hand, we can consider this a recount of very real things that very much actually literally happened, but also just so happens to explain the way that the seasons change. Now the question that I ask, what purpose did this myth serve in the time and place in which it was written? And that gave me a whole lot more answers. The hymn itself is a metatextual commentary on the actual practice of bridal abduction. In the very real time and the very real place of ancient Greece, there was the practice of bridal abduction that was a part of arranged marriages, of which the only person's consent who was needed was the father of the bride. And all it took was a possible suitor to go ahead and say, "Hey, can I have your daughter?" So by this myth, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, being constructed in this way, it provided a meta-narrative that gave commentary on something that people were actually experiencing and something that people were actually suffering. And it demonstrated the way that mothers grieved the loss of their daughters, of whom they almost never ever saw again, and the consequences of this kind of thing having on the bride. Now, stories, especially myths, are subject to change over time. But if we turn the dial back to some of the earliest translations and the earliest recordings of this myth, Persephone was abducted against her will. And when she partakes in the pomegranate, the seeds that then bind her to the underworld, this is all euphemistic and metaphorical for Hades' own seed. Because with this being said, the marriage was not considered to be actually legitimate until the actual consummation was taken place. And if Persephone was taken unwillingly, why would she be willing to partake in that? And we can consider this to be factual in at least some of the earliest versions of the hymn, because when she returns to her mother at the end of the story, she recounts that it was an unpleasant experience and that Hades forced himself onto her, whether it's directly saying it or forcing the pomegranate seed onto her. This is explained in the myth that Persephone did not have a good time and was traumatized by the experience. However, some people will still argue this and say that this is speculation or hearsay or made up. But in the Orphic hymn to Persephone, it says that she was raped in her marriage bed in late autumn. And furthermore, people still insist that Persephone was taken willingly, but it says right there in the Orphic hymn to Hades, "Impelled by love you flew, till a Lucinia's city rose to view. There in a wondrous cave obscure and deep, the sacred maid secure from search you keep. The cave of Attis, whose wide gates display the gates to the city, void of day," something like that. And none of this is to try to assert or profess that there is one true way to interpret the story. What I am trying to suggest, though, is that thanks to the Sandman comics, it has helped me to understand that there is an important to open up myth as at least a story about the gods. That way we can interpolate and extrapolate and try to understand these myths more intimately, understanding a metatextual narrative or understanding there is one there and trying to figure out what it might be. And because so many people are believing, or at least speaking as if they believe, that these myths are genuine accounts of things that literally happened, it's not leaving room for the suspension of disbelief. Because it's in this suspension of disbelief that we can allow a story to take over us, while at the same time not believing in it 100%. And this suspension of disbelief is necessary for stories to allow us to dream. And when we wind up taking the myths literally, we wind up defending our darling deities while at the same time not really looking deeper into the cultural, historical, and religious context that would make the meta-narrative seem much more important. And with this, there's a lot, whether deliberately or accidentally, that is getting erased. And even if you are someone who is like me and believes in the very real existence of these divine beings, this doesn't take away from them. We can simply reframe it to suggest that these are stories about the gods. And because they are about the gods, we have familiar characters inserted into these stories that allow us to explore a deeper meaning to our inner selves and the world around us. And this is part of why media literacy is so important when it comes to interpreting myth. And this is also why the death of media literacy and taking all of the myths as literal factual accounts of historical events, our dreams can very easily turn into nightmares very quickly. In order to drive home the point of why media literacy is so important when interpreting myth, I want to use a very popular and famous example of what happens when we do start taking myth literally. And that would be Christianity. The characters of Cain and Abel are in the Sandman comics as well as the Netflix adaptation, and they are sort of stuck in this abusive cycle where Cain is constantly finding reasons to kill Abel, for Abel to rise from the dead just to be killed all over again. And I feel like, whether it was intended or not, this perfectly portrays what sort of happens in this situation. Now, when it comes to this book, I really like this book, but for reasons that probably aren't the usual. Because when I read this book, I see each book within the Bible as a text that came from a different author and probably came from a different time compared to the one that came before it and the one that comes after it. And when we actually take the time to learn about the cultural, historical, and religious context about what went into making each book, we can start to understand what audience that these books were actually intended for, which for the most part was never intended to be a Christian audience. From what I can tell, most of, if not all of the Old Testament is Jewish scripture that has been appropriated, re-represented, and rebranded in order to fit a Christian context. And now that is the thickest portion of the Bible. This bigger portion right here is the Old Testament. Now, in most fundamentalist and evangelical settings that I am currently aware of, the Bible is intended to be viewed as an unequivocal, univocal, true word of God. But by doing this, we are removing all of the context, all of the history, and everything that went into making the Bible even before Christianity was established, in order to suggest it as one big bubble that at least is the product of God's will. Now, this winds up meaning that true history winds up getting completely thrown out the window in order to be re-established under a Christian dogma. And the only interpretations that are allowed are Christian interpretations, if any at all. And it is courtesy of a whole history of disagreements that have granted us the multiple different delineations and denomination and schools of Christian thought that now wind up having different congregations and different ideologies within their own congregation. Now, I'm not saying that all of the trouble could have been avoided, but a lot of it could have at least been different if the proper context was either available or allowed, if it was available, to understand and interpret the meaning of the Bible. But now that any and all proper context has been stricken from the record and isn't really introduced into the conversations about interpretation of the Bible, it winds up being framed as an account of true historical events that actually took place, and not just stories, but an account of real things that actually happened. And now this becomes a problem when we consider the fact that the entire book ends with everybody dying. Furthermore, this is something that people actively want and wish for, either one, to rid the world of all the sinners, or two, it's when Jesus gets to come back. Even though when we actually provide the context for the book of Revelation, the end where everybody dies, it was actually written by an exiled individual by the name of John of Patmos, because it was on Patmos, an island outside of Turkey, where he had a fever dream of which he used all kinds of Jewish mystical code as a cipher in order to write down anti-Roman government sentiments in order to foretell the downfall of the Roman Empire, because it was believed that Jesus would return in their lifetime, because this is something that Jesus told people in his ministry, and this is accounted for earlier in the gospel, that he would return in their lifetime, and that didn't happen. And when we realize that Jesus was genuinely an individual who was a radical and was a Jewish preacher who really wanted the best for his own people and was really upset with the fact that the religious authorities of the time were metaphorically in bed with the Roman authority of whom was oppressing his people, you understand why the book of Revelation might actually be coded in some sort of mystical cipher for those who know, to be able to understand. That way John of Patmos could get away with writing seditious writings. And yet, because this context isn't provided, we are now able to put this prophecy at a future date, which is exactly why a lot of people are cheering on the absolute atrocities taking place in the Middle East currently, because the day that the world stands against Israel is the day that Armageddon is hearkened and is the beginning of the end. But it was never a prophecy that was supposed to happen in the future. It was supposed to happen in their lifetime then. You see what I'm getting at here? There's a problem when we wind up taking myth literally and removing the cultural, historical, and religious context and just take things at face value. And now, with a twisting of the interpretations and a history of violence where Christianity has been used as a political tool in order to desecrate entire civilizations, completely eradicate entire peoples, and force religious syncretism to erase and combine different cultures' religions, that way they can find their way in to take over a region, a nation, or a culture. The Crusades, the witch hunts, the Spanish Inquisition, the conquistadors in South America are all things that have been allowed to take place. Absolute atrocities that we're all familiar with, that has been fueled by religious thinking and sentiment and ideation, that was made possible because people were taking this fucking book at face value and taking everything literally and believing it to be a univocal, unequivocal, true word of one God. And although witches and pagans are not in the same position of political power as Christians and Catholics are, therefore being able to fund the atrocities taking place across the entire world and pass legislation based on religious sentiments, almost successfully establishing an American theocracy, where now these individuals are using this goddamn book to justify the illegalization of people's very existence, taking away from the quality of life for the average person to just get by and survive, not even thrive. We still can wind up from suffering the same kind of, if not similar, delusional religious ideations that Christians do. Same shit, different shapes. And that's why media literacy in myth and interpretation and establishing some kind of meta-narrative where we can suspend our disbelief and not buy a whole 100% into it, but still talk about these gods as if they are real, is so important and something that needs to be established and encouraged. And this is exactly why people draw parallels between the god spouses of Loki and the Snape wives of Tumblr. It's not too different. And this is not a condemnation of the phenomenon or modern convention of god spousal. But we need to step aside sometimes and think about what the outside observer is seeing. No wonder people think that we're off our rocker and absolutely unhinged. And with that, I believe it's time that we move on to another subject in this video. What exactly is a dream? What are dreams made of? And what does it mean for one to dream? These are the questions that the Sandman series invites us to ask. And you that call yourselves collectors, until now you have all sustained fantasies in which you are the maltreated heroes of your own stories, comforting daydreams in which ultimately you are shown to be in the right. No more. For all of you, the dream is over. I have taken it away. For this is my judgment on you, that you shall know at all times and forever exactly what you are, and you shall know just how little that means. Now leave. In the comics as well as in the show, there's a series of events that leads Dream to a serial convention, which is a code for a convention full of serial killers. And although there are a number of reasons as to why a dream is there, one of those reasons is to catch up with a rogue nightmare of his that he had created, who has been encouraging these serial killers to continue living this daydream and fantasy that enables their want and desire to kill other human beings. After having confronted this nightmare, the Corinthian, he then turns to the spectators, the serial killers at this serial convention, and that is what he tells them. Courtesy of being the King of Dreams, he is able to take their fantasy, their delusion, their daydream, the things that they have told themselves, the comforting lies that have allowed them to justify their incredibly heinous actions. This then suggests the idea that fantasies, daydreams, and delusions are also of the realm of dreams. And this gets me to start asking myself some interesting questions. And I'm going to share a couple of those thoughts here because, in the very least, I found it interesting, even though, well, let's just get to it. Although I myself am not a serial killer, therefore cannot relate to this particular phenomenon that's being referenced in the show and in the comics, I myself being the host of a DID system who hasn't always been the host of my system, I've asked myself the question, what does it mean to be a person? Now, I understand that the speculation puts me at odds with the point of view of others, but maybe there are some who can relate. Now, please keep in mind for what I'm about to say next, I am an armchair psychologist at the absolute best, therefore I'm not a reliable source of information. With that being said, take everything I say with a heavy heaping of salt, because this is just me sharing some thoughts and my own internal musings. Sigmund Freud, one of the forefathers of modern psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, posited, or in the very least made famous, the idea of the id, ego, and superego, the different layers of the individual person that make up an identity. The id sounding a lot like the inner desire, the more carnal and primal impulses that lead us towards certain actions and behaviors. Then we have the ego, which is a culmination of the things that we could consider to be a sense of self, whether that be based on past experience leading us to a conclusion or an opinion about something, or that being the lies that we tell ourselves about who we are. Somewhere in that is an identity and a sense of self. And then there is the superego. Now, the superego is sort of an intangible thing, even though it seems easy to try to explain, because effectively the superego is the mask that we wear to take on the day. This is the version of us that shakes a customer's hand while we're at work. It's the one who is putting up with the bullshit when we are being scolded by our boss. It is also the superego that is entertaining guests when people are at our home. And it winds up depending on the person, how much of your ego you are showing to your close friends and loved ones. All this just to suggest what makes up a person is difficult. And a lot of people, myself included, have asked the question, well, which one of this is the real us? To which the best answer is, the truth lies somewhere in the mixture of it all. But with everything that I said here, again, please fact check me and go do your own research, because I'm probably misunderstanding something here. But regardless, it's made me wonder and ponder, what is me? Who am I? If even psychology cannot explain to me who and what I am, or comprehensively navigate myself to be able to try and figure it out without, years of intense therapy, what is people? Are we as individuals simply the product of past experiences, preferences, carnal desires and impulses, as well as who we think we are based on the way that we interact with the world around us, and how we come to hold opinions about the people in the world around us? Are we just a collection of stories with a whole bunch of opinions on those stories? I entertained this thought for a while, but honestly I came to the conclusion that people are far more complex than that. And part of the reason why psychotherapy and psychology is changing, advancing, and progressing every single day is because the human psyche is not an easy thing to try to understand. And I think it is in this intangible quality that people are that really brings home the point that a little bit of this all is true, and maybe a large majority of it is false. And as a personal aside, I'm going to share my opinion that trying to suggest that any one person is just a collection of anything other than being a person is a banal and disingenuous attempt to try and quantify something that is intangible and unquantifiable. But that's just me. And now that I have gone on this quasi-psychological side tangent just to come to the conclusion and reassert that people are a lot more complicated and therefore individuals are valid in spite of what some suggestions might proclaim, let's take another look at what this is actually suggesting to us and actually look at what the comic or the show is actually trying to say about dreams, fantasies, and delusions. In order to recenter this segment of the video, I want to take another look at the scene that I initially referenced, but this time I want to take a look at the scene from the show, because quite frankly, I personally feel as if the TV version did a lot more justice and brought a lot more gravitas to the situation at hand.
And you, who call yourselves collectors, Until now, you have sustained fantasies in which you are the victims. Comforting daydreams in which you are always right. But no more. The dream is over. I have taken it away, for this is my judgment upon you. That you shall know from this moment on exactly how craven and selfish and monstrous you are. That you shall feel the pain of those you have slaughtered.
Hello, 911. I'm calling to confess to a crime.
And the grief of those that mourn them still. And you shall carry that pain and grief and guilt with you until the end of time.
First of all, in this scene, it is immediately after Dream has stopped the Corinthian, and in some way I feel he's trying to take responsibility for what his nightmare has caused, and even though he can't undo what has been done, he can do what he can to bring an end to the continuous torment. Which honestly shows a lot of character growth and development for Dream as a character. But I also feel that the way that this scene is delivered really helps bring home the point of what makes Dream able to have dominion over their delusions and fantasies. It's because the lies that they tell themselves that construct the delusion in which they live in is a far cry from the reality of the actual horror that they have caused others. The thing about dreams is that they're not real. Let's think about dreams in the most popular and easy to explain version. It's what happens when we sleep. Our minds will come up with something in order to hand us while we sleep. Sometimes it's dreams and it's a decent recreation of real life, or it's a little bit bonkers on off the wall, but whatever the case may be, it didn't really happen. So with this being said, if they are in a delusion, it means that the thing that they are believing in isn't the truth of the matter. Because these serial killers exist in a daydream that is a far cry from reality, it is considered enough to be a dream and a story that they can construct for themselves and live and thrive within, and it allows them to distance themselves from the actual atrocities that they are committing. And because it isn't real, is what makes it possible for Dream to have dominion over it. But the show and the comic go all the way out of their way to explain that dreams are necessary, and that dreams are a part of what make us us, in spite of the fact that it isn't real. And for this, I want to bring up and reference 24/7, aka the diner sequence. Now, earlier in this video, I did mention that 24/7, the diner sequence, gives us one of the most horrifying issues in the comic itself, which then allows for one of the most horrifying episodes of the TV show. And this is the one I'm going to be talking about, because it all centers around the character John Dee. And although he is John Dee in both the show and the comic, the show, for whatever reason, doesn't have the ability to also make him the villain, Dr. Destiny. So for the sake of cohesion, I'm just going to refer to this character as John Dee, since it is still John Dee in both. John Dee is able to escape either Arkham Asylum or some kind of highest security containment facility, and when he leaves, he attains the Ruby, which rightfully belongs to Dream, which is an item that Dream is trying to find and reacquire. With this Ruby, John is able to control the dreams of others. And it's sort of implied that this is how he has always been able to do his thing, and is how he wound up in whatever facility he wound up in. It is at this point that John Dee is able to be at a diner in which everybody other than himself is a completely new character. He serves basically as a fly on the wall who is watching everybody, but at the same time orchestrating events. And what he's doing basically is pulling away the lies that people tell themselves, because this technically constitutes as the realm of dreams. And with this, the cold, harsh truth starts to come out. At first, the people in the diner are able to come to some sort of stunning revelation or some kind of truth reveal for themselves as they're interacting with the waitress or the cook or other people who are customers at the diner. And there's even a moment where it seems as if there could be a happy ending for some of these people, until John Dee pulls them back. And we never see what's outside of the diner. But we do see that as more of the truth is revealed and more of the dreams and the comfortable lies are pulled back, people become violent. People become angry, either unable to cope with what they've learned about themselves and taking it on themselves to harm themselves, or they don't like what they just realized about the person across the table from them and start to harm and even kill the other patrons of the diner. I forget if it's in the comic off the top of my head, but in the very least in the Netflix adaptation, John Dee has a moment where he reveals to one of the people in the diner that on a long enough timeline, all stories end in death, which sort of foreshadows what's going to happen. And as the story unfolds and this story appears to be ending in death, that's when Morpheus steps in. Finally, after all this time, Morpheus steps in, an immortal being whose story personally does not end in death because he does not die. And this is where things get interesting. For the most part, it is appearing that John Dee's own twisted philosophy about lies needing to be extinguished and only the truth being revealed, but people not being able to handle the truth, seems to be convinced as correct and accurate. And in many ways, this makes me think of Plato's parable of the cave, where Plato posits this idea, this parable, this allegory, where we think of people who have lived in a cave, tied to the cave, their entire life. And in this cave, they are able to see the shadows on the wall. And all they really have is themselves in the cave and the display of shadows on the wall of the cave. This is their life. This is all that they know. And suggest for a moment that one of these individuals was able to break free of their containment and then start to see outside of the cave, or even just in the cave, realizing that the light's performance that casts the shadow is from a fire. And they're realizing that all they've ever known has just been shadows on a wall, having no concept of shadows and no concept of fire itself. And then they leave the cave and see that there is a whole world out there that they have never known in their entire life. This has been the philosophical quandary of many different forms of media. Most prominently that I can think of is The Matrix. And just like John Dee's little philosophy here on what the truth is and waking up from a dream might entail, the truth outside of the cave is bleak and morbid and desolate. And then Morpheus proves it all wrong. First and foremost, when Morpheus does enter the scene, it is outside the diner. And this is the first time that we, as the viewer or the reader, see outside the diner. And we see that he hasn't just been doing this to the diner and the people in the diner. This has been happening to everybody in an indeterminate radius because the buildings are on fire and cars are overturned and bodies are on the ground. And this is why Morpheus has to step in and convince John Dee that he is wrong.
You're wrong. This is the truth of mankind.
How's work going? Good, you know, busy.
They're lying to themselves.
Gary's supervising a new venture that looks promising.
It's all lies.
Not lies, John. Dreams.
Right, sweetie?
Kate dreams of running away where no one will find her.
How are you, Bet?
Gary dreams of proving his father was wrong about him.
How's Bernard doing? How's your writing going?
Your house, the novel. Good, you know?
Bet dreams of creating something that matters to people. Their dreams inspired them.
I thought I'd have more time to write with Bernard off at college, but it's been great having him home, so...
Their dreams kept them alive. But if you rob them of their dreams, if you take away their hope, then, yes, this is the truth of mankind.
Dreams are important. Dreams move us. They inspire us. They help us to reveal to ourselves what it is we desire. Our dreams, the things that we talk about, the things that we think about, the things that we spend our time immersed, totally enraptured in, are important because they mean something to us. And the reason that it means something to us reveals to us exactly what it is we dream about and the reason why each one of us individually dreams of something. Sometimes the lies that we tell ourselves aren't comforting delusions or misrepresentations of things, but if we stay grounded in reality, we won't get too terribly caught up in a delusion, but instead our dreams can reveal to us the goals in which we inspire and aspire to. And that is part of what makes dreams so goddamn important. Whether they be the dreams that we have at night, the dreams that reveal to us our desires and our aspirations and give us goals to strive toward to attain, or they are the collective dreams of others that we share and partake in for the hope and future of a better tomorrow. But now that we have gotten to this point in the video and established as much as we have, what's the difference between a dream and a nightmare? Honorable, surely you joke. Look around you, Morpheus. The million lords of hell stand around you. Tell us, why should we let you leave? Helmet and now, you have no power here. For what power do dreams have in hell? You say that I have no power here. Perhaps you speak truly, but you say that dreams have no power here. Tell me, Lightbearer. Ask yourselves, all of you, what power would hell have if the denizens of it could not dream of heaven? Now, did I have to recreate that scene? No. But did I have a lot of fun because it's one of my favorite scenes? Yes. Yes, this is true. Now, another reason why I wanted to recreate that scene in my own fun little artistic re-rendition is because that entire sequence, I feel, shows us exactly what the difference between nightmares and dreams are. Now, even though I appreciate both sequences in the comics as well as in the TV show, I want to focus on the TV adaptation because personally I feel it really draws this point home in a way that the comics just didn't, at least not for me. This entire series of events comes to us when Dream is looking for his helmet, or just his helm, and in order to find it, he has to go to hell. Quite literally. So the entire process of getting the helm takes place in hell, which, whether you are somebody who believes that hell is a very real place, which is a pit of fire and torment for sinners, or you're more practical and come to the conclusion that hell is just a collection of different literary devices for the mythological implication of what happens when you're not being obedient to God, or in the very least, this could be an allegory for what it feels like when God is absent from your spirit. I think it's easy to say that hell is the Christian nightmare. Now, when Dream arrives to hell, he arrives at the gates, and we sort of get this little bit of a tour, if you will, as there is a person, a demon, who is guiding Dream through hell to convene with Lord Lucifer. After talking with Lucifer is when it is revealed that Dream's helmet is in the possession of another demon, Karanzan, who in real life almost didn't exist before Aleister Crowley started writing down his magical rituals and the results of them, and encountered the spirit Karanzan, the spirit of dispersion who guards the pylons between Doth and the Abyss, if I'm remembering correctly. However, in this setting, he is nothing more than the demon that's got Dream's helm. And in order to get his helm back, Dream has to do battle in order to retrieve it. In the comics, he partakes in this battle with Karanzan himself. In the show, Lucifer steps in as Karanzan's champion, taking his place. I've got opinions on the difference and why it's important, but for the TV show, I understand why they made this distinction and decided to change it a little bit, because nobody fucking knows who Karanzan is. Everybody has at least heard of Lucifer Morningstar. Also, it just feels a little more satisfying watching two kings of their respective realms go toe-to-toe with one another. And I am still going to insist that it is a battle, because even though they don't draw weapons or partake in fisticuffs, they're still doing battle, and I like the way that they frame it, because it shows us what it might look like if cosmic entities did battle, but in such a way that it's only going to harm themselves. Because for the most part, from what I can tell, the entire battle is mental. For those of you who are familiar with the Stephen King universe, particularly It, consider it to be much like a gentleman's game in the Ritual of Chud. One thing leads to another. Of course, the narrative dictates that it's necessary that Dream gets his helm back, so that's why he wins. Plot armor, if nothing else. But that's when that initial scene comes in. Now, I want to go to the end of this gentleman's game of the Ritual of Chud, the way that it's depicted in the show, because that's where I'm really drawing my conclusion from in the point I'm trying to make here.
What is it that kills hope?
Thematically, it's beautiful. Dream is talking to the devil, and they are partaking in what they're calling the oldest game. And there's nothing that can beat hope. And that's what dreams are. Or in the very least, that's what they instill in us. And when a dream is without hope, is when that dream becomes a nightmare. Now, even though the ending sequences to these scenes are a little bit different, first and foremost, Lucifer stepping forward and asking, "Why should we let you leave?" in the comic is just the devil being the devil. He's been polite, a steward, and courteous the entire time up until that final moment. Here, they still have the same scene as best as they can. But because Lucifer just lost, it kind of just makes him look like a sore loser. But I still think it serves the purpose of what that message is supposed to be at the end of this sequence before Dream leaves. Why should we let you leave? Helmet or no? Dreams have no power here. To which Dream responds, "You say I have no power here. That might be true. But you say dreams have no power here? Tell me, what power would you have if the people imprisoned here could not dream of heaven?" And I know I did not say it verbatim here or at the recreation of the scene that I did a few minutes ago in the video, but I think what matters more is the point that's gotten across. Is that if there is no hope for heaven, then hell has no power over those who are there. Which is exactly why I felt it was awesome thematically that the scene takes place in hell, which is also why John Dee was wrong trying to take people's dreams away, thinking that leads people to the truth, because there's a difference between a dream and a lie. Dreams that we hold to ourselves don't remove us from reality, don't remove us from truth. But they do give us goals to look forward to because it instills the hope that's within us. I've been making videos for several years now, and although I can't say I'm exactly great at making YouTube content, I'm at least decent at making videos. And since I have been working on very low budget, meaning no budget at all, to make the content that I have been creating, I also know that when I go to edit this particular part of this video, I myself am going to appreciate the grainy, low-quality effect that this is having, only having the outside porch light on and the black backyard encompassed by the darkness of the night. And in spite of my pride calling myself the world's worst YouTuber and getting away with it, I do have to say I have learned some things along the way, especially since I've been making longer content and videos that are reaching into the 1 to 2 hour mark. Yeah, there's some tricks that I picked up by trial and error. One of those tricks and things that I have learned is to pace myself. Don't try to do it all in one day. And when I get to a creative roadblock, maybe that's a good time to stop and go back over and edit what I've got so far. Because I think quite possibly my most toxic trait as a video maker is that I don't script a goddamn thing. There are videos that I have scripted in the past, don't get me wrong, because it helped me formulate what I was going to do, think about what I was going to say, but I realize oftentimes I could have just done it without the script, which is why I don't script anymore. I wind up not making a video until I've talked a lot of these points down to the barest bones, and it's only then, now that I have talked off the ears of the people that I live with, that I finally commit it to a video. And as a writer of short stories and enthusiast of storytelling all around, it is just 15 minutes before filming this very clip that I learned that in the world of writing, I am what is called a, what did you call it?
Pantser.
A pantser. See, I needed reminding. Because even though it has been some time, some many years since I have actually written a short story, when I do write, this is exactly how I write. I don't formulate or storyboard anything. I just go at it, make my first draft, and I read back over it fixing it as I'm going at least 5 times before I hand it to somebody else to read. And although it has taken me until my early 30s to actually figure out anything about myself as a person, individual, aside from being a part of a DID system, aside from being habitually in some sort of toxic relationship, I am now finally getting back to talking about the things that make me excited when I was a child. One of the reasons why this particular One of the reasons why this particular video is somewhat of a passion project for myself is because I once upon a time was a child who loved comic books. In fact, I don't know if I would be who I am today if it wasn't for comic books. See, I was severely bullied as a child, suffering at home the type of trauma that would turn somebody into a DID system. And one of my first great escapes was comic books. So in order to fill in the blanks of my life, I started telling stories where I was the self-insert. And this is how I came up with my first comic book character, Darren Michael Thompson, who now is evolved into the character that I've portrayed here on my platform, Darren T. Smith. And as a child who was riddled with self-doubt, I wanted to make comics, but realized that my art was not super great. So if I was going to do anything to some consequential effect to creating a comic book, that would be in the writing and the character creation and the concepts and coming up with the story in and of itself, and I would probably need to find somebody else to be the illustrator. But part of the reason that my first comic book character was a self-insert was because I saw myself in a lot of the characters that the Darren character is like. A outcast, an outsider, angry at the world, being incredibly furious and fed up with a concept of justice that only serves some kind of justice to those who abide by some sort of moral and ethical standing that is pre-approved, and for an undiagnosed autistic child, I couldn't understand what those rules were. Even if they were said plain out to me, I would then follow the rules and didn't understand the subtext of what was implied by the rules and still find a way to get in trouble. So as to where I was a big fan of comic book heroes such as Spider-Man, all of a sudden Spawn and Azrael and the Punisher became a form of catharsis for me. But since I had gotten into comic books in the late 90s and early 2000s, I didn't know where to start other than just picking up an issue, and then when I had access to the internet, finally, I would start learning about these comic book characters by blog posts and forum posts and anybody who was willing to tell me anything about these characters. So when I started getting into the occult and actually practicing something magical as a teenager, it's not surprising, and therefore safe to assume that I started approaching deities in a very similar way. I would hear about them, learn about them, then go online and learn as much as I could, and eventually I would come to learn why it is so important to learn the context as to where these spirits and deities were a part of a culture of origin and had their own folklore, oftentimes folklore that was pre-Christian and sometimes even pre-Jewish for that matter. And in spite of everything, wanting to believe, going out to seek an experience for myself, it became quickly and abundantly obvious to myself that the human element of these stories and these religions and these mythologies, it is the humans that make them, literally and figuratively. Whether we're talking about the ways in which gods interact with mortals, or we're talking about the fact that it was literally a fucking human that, pretend this is a pen for a minute, picked up the pen and started writing it down. There's always human error, human bias, human interpretation. And that's why now, even if we are going to try to understand the cultural, historical, and religious context of these beings, we still gotta keep in mind that the human element is what is the X factor, if you will. So imagine my surprise and downright elation to find out that many of the comic book authors that I had become familiar with were also occultists and magicians themselves, most notably Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. Now, to find out that Alan Moore was a magician himself was a little bit of a moment for me, because this is the guy that had originally created the character John Constantine. And, oh boy, John Constantine was significant to me because he was a DC comic book character who, in a world full of superhumans and superheroes and supervillains, was just a guy that did magic. And although it was written in later to fully explain what the Laughing Magician is and what that inheritance grants John Constantine, he's still just a guy. He's not superhuman. He's not superpowered. He uses magic and just has a little bit of a boost or a buffer to grant him an edge when he is doing magic. And at this conjunction in my early teen life, when I started learning a lot about John Constantine and started learning a little bit about occultism, this character meant everything to me. Although being a superhero isn't something we can reasonably or feasibly do in the real world, it still gave me this idea that even in a situation where, courtesy of everything that life has handed us, we are insignificant comparatively, whether that be in social standing, whether that be in our own personal standing, or just contemplating the insignificance of humans and mortality, there's John Constantine, who's, although not exactly a character you want to be or be like, is still just a guy who's using his wit, his cunning, his intelligence, and his cynical point of view to dupe and swindle not only demons and deities, but superheroes and supervillains as well, when all he is a magician. And then we have Grant Morrison, who, although is also a comic book author, illustrator, and magician, is sort of the photo negative of Alan Moore, because Alan Moore is more of a hermetic, Kabbalistic type of magical thinker, and Grant Morrison is a chaos magician who has a story about a time that he went to Kathmandu and was able to talk to Jesus and may or may not have spoken to interdimensional time sprites. Magic, comic books, and storytelling are all things that are incredibly important to me, which is why a character like Sandman, Dream of the Endless, Lord Morpheus, a character who can rub the fourth wall without breaking it, establish meta-narratives between the DC universe, our real world universe, and the reader themselves, and take timeless stories such as Greek myth or Shakespeare's plays and help us to reimagine them and reinterpret them without doing a whole lot to change the actual source material. It also deals with things of the occult and of that nature. It also delves a lot into magic and the way that these anthropomorphic concepts that are effectively gods in their own right are relevant not just to the characters in the stories, but are relevant to us. And with that being said, I think now is the perfect time to say that I have had several dreams. When I was a child, I wanted to be a comic book writer, and then I wanted to be a story writer. I also wanted to be a photographer, as well as a director, and in some ways, I wanted to be an actor. There are so many things that I wanted to do, which include, but are not limited to, being a comedian, or being a rock star for that matter. These are all things that I had dreams to do, and either real life got in my way, or a parental figure told me that isn't practical and I should rethink what I'm doing. Somebody that I trusted said, in the politest way possible, that's not going to work out, that's kind of silly, maybe you should think about college. And at this point, I feel as if the devil is in the details when it comes to this, because if you look at what I do here, what I have done for the last several years, I keep coming back even though it hasn't really panned out in my favor. I keep coming back because there's something new that I can think of doing, or a different approach to going about videos the way that I had been doing them. But I can be a photographer, and a director, and an actor, and a storyteller. And most importantly, I get to talk about the things that I love. And I have come to realize over time, hang on. I have come to realize over time that when it comes to magic, there aren't a lot of people that actually want facts. They want something to believe in. And I know this because of the way that I've talked about Lucifer. For about 3 years now at this point, I have been regularly and consistently uploading to the witchy side of TikTok, which is where a lot of my current subscribers here are actually from. And almost right away, I start talking about demons and Lucifer. Because I had always had this question ever since I was a kid. Who the fuck is Lucifer? Because none of the answers I found were satisfying to me. I would go through history and I would go through a whole bunch of different things to try and find a way to answer this question. Who is Lucifer? And over the next couple of years, I would come to a point where I would share the history of things. The sigil of Lucifer is also referred to as the Sigillum Satanis or Sigillum Diabolus, and it is also referred to as the Seal of Satan, and it wasn't found in print until, what was it, the 14th century, in the Grimorium Verum, or the Great Grimoire, where Lucifer and Astaroth and Beelzebub are framed as the king, prince, and duke of hell. But the fact that it was in that time and place means that this grimoire was a product of the time and place, and is a timestamp of the beliefs that were in that area at that time in that place. But people just want to say that it is the sigil of Lucifer and leave it at that. Also, when you get right down to the nitty-gritty of things and we start talking about Lucifer, this is a title and a moniker that several different beings have worn throughout time. But a lot of the beliefs about Lucifer come from multiple different Lucifer deities, demons, or spirits. For example, we have the Roman deity who is Lucifer, who actually is not the Roman deity Venus, who is syncretized with Aphrodite, Hathor, and Ishtar for reasons that I frankly don't think I have the time to get into right now. And somehow along the way, Enki, the Mesopotamian god, got lumped in with all of these Lucifer names and monikers and identities. And my work started panning out for me when I picked them apart and looked at each one in their context, and come to find out all of them are Lucifer. There is not one Lucifer. All of them are valid. But if you want a Lucifer who is an angel, is the twin of Archangel Michael, is divinely wed to Lilith, then you're going to find Samael. Samael is an angel who in some texts is described as having been on one hand the firstborn, but also born at the same time as Michael, his twin. He is also a character who has worn the title of Hasatan or Shaitan or whichever interpretation of some proto-Satan you want to consider, which actually is not a name, it is a job description. It is a title who is a member of the heavenly host. This is God's executioner, God's punisher, and also, furthermore, Samael is referred to as the left hand of God, and although he has nothing to do with the planet Venus and is more associated with Mars and Pluto, because these are the ruling bodies of Scorpio, which is the zodiac sign that he presides over, according to some schools of thought and tradition, Samael is also the one who went to the Garden of Eden to tempt Eve, and then also successfully tempted Adam. And it was for the fact that he tempted Adam that he became the first of the fallen, the first damn thing, the first spirit to transgress against God, and became the first of the fallen. For reference to the Garden of Eden story, look no further than the apocryphal scriptures titled as the Apocalypse of Baruch as well as the Ascension of Isaiah, and these things are written out there, and although they are non-canonical texts, Lucifer also isn't canonical. Anytime that the word Lucifer is in the Bible, it is a translation from the title of Satan or Shaitan or one of those names. And this again is a position in the heavenly host. It's a job title and description, but because of the Christian mindset getting carried away from context, it got translated into Lucifer. Now, there is one exception that I can think of, which is in Isaiah 14:12, where we have the line, "O Lucifer, son of morning, how fallen thou art." You know, that famous line. But it wasn't about a divine being. It was about the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And if we look at the rest of the book of Isaiah, it becomes clear. And if we look at the books before and after Isaiah, it is clear that we are talking about Nebuchadnezzar. It was never about a divine being to begin with, but in the Hebrew text, it oftentimes gets translated into Hallel ben Shahar, which then takes us to a Canaanite deity who was by the name of Hallel ben Shahar, who was associated with the planet Venus, because Hallel ben Shahar means Lucifer, son of Shahar, who was a Canaanite deity that was literally the dawn. And Venus, the morning star, was the planet that rose up first in the morning that came before the sun during the dawn. But we're not talking about the deity Hallel ben Shahar. That's the only reason that character ever got roped into with the Christian mythos of Lucifer Morningstar. And I know that I've probably gone on a little too long about Lucifer Morningstar in this video, but it was to say and suggest that here's the research I've done, the things that I've come to learn about it, and when presented to the magical community on TikTok, it gets shut down. People don't like it. People don't want to hear it. Nobody wants to hear that Samael and Lucifer are one and the same because it doesn't make sense to them. But what happened was, Samael got slapped with the moniker of Lucifer, and since there were so many other spirits that were associated with this title, everybody looked there other than at Samael. Then, to what do my wondering eyes behold? Before I even got into the Sandman series, when this clip was being shown as a promotional advertisement for the Netflix adaptation.
Sacred Lucifer, morning star.
As in the devil?
The ruler of hell is no mere devil.
So you two know each other?
We've known each other for a very long time. When we first met, Lucifer was the angel Samael.
I forgot the devil used to be an angel.
Did you see that shit? Did you see that shit? I understand that this is a comic book adaptation, but I had just received more validation from a commercial for an adaptation of a comic that at that point I had never read yet than I had from an entire community of magical practitioners that I was supposed to be a part of. Once again, the rules didn't make sense, because the rules were explained to me. Do your research. Do the research into cultural, historical, and religious context. And that's what I did. And when I came back with that information, nope. And a goddamn person want to hear it? Not my Lucifer, no. And it was at least enough to tell me that I wasn't crazy. Even if it was not a popular take, the research that I had collected, somebody else outside of the community that I was a part of also understood that once upon a time, Lucifer Morningstar was referred to as Samael. And this just brings me back to a very famous quote that I forget who said it originally, although it's very often attributed to Albert Camus. Fiction is the lie that tells the truth. And instead of trying to rehash everything here to go back over it, in order to protect myself from sounding unhinged, I think everything that I've done in this video so far is explaining exactly why and how fiction is the lie that tells the truth. Because of a fictional character, I have been able to explore media literacy, myth, and magic, all to a degree that without this fictional character, this comic book, this Netflix adaptation being a part of my life, it would not have revolutionized my understanding or appreciation for any of these things the way that I have come to understand it now. A fictional character showing me a whole world of fiction and dreams and fairy tales and stories and mythical creatures has helped me to understand and appreciate life that much better. And then, to this, we still have the question, what are dreams? And in spite of all of my big brains and the deepest stinkles in the deepest wrinkles of this big old noggin right here, I don't fucking know. They are a thing that all, if not most of us, experience when we lay our head down at night, close our eyes. Sometimes they're pleasant dreams, sometimes they're bonker dreams, sometimes they are nightmares. And there are a lot of people that are of the popular opinion that dreams are a way for our mind to play out the things that are in our unconscious state, or when we are not awake and not engaging with the mundane life, our subconscious has a way of playing these dramas out for us, telling us little stories so we can work something out, or experience something, or go into the next day having something that we experienced even though we never actually experienced it. But this still brings us to the question, how did this come to evolve and develop in the human brain evolutionarily? What purpose does it or did it serve for us to have dreams in the first place? I don't know. I know magic, comic books, and media. I know pop culture references and how to wave a wand and think for 5 minutes that I'm actually channeling energy through it. I know how to talk about the ins and outs of liminality and media literacy and why I appreciate certain characters and why, even to this day, even though I'm talking about deities and magical schools of thought and magical systems, it's because comic books. It's because comic books. I probably would not like these things, and if I did, I wouldn't like them in the same way if it wasn't for comic books. Jesus Christ. And yet, there is something about dreams in the experience that make myself and an entire TikTok community called Dream Talk wonder if there's something more to it. makes us wonder if there isn't some way that dreams connect us all, whether it be by literally being able to travel from one dream to somebody else's dream, or by the fact that we have a nigh universal experience, that being dreams, that being sleeping and experiencing dreams to begin with connects us and unites us all in some way that, at least for most of us, is universal. Because I'm aware that there are some people that either, for whatever reason, don't remember their dreams, or for some neurological explanation, physically cannot dream. And I want to make mention that if you are one of the people that experiences this lack of dreams, I still see you. And I appreciate you. But let's go ahead and risk sounding a little unhinged and actually talk about dreams from a more mystical and spooky perspective. There I am in the summer of 2022. I had just moved into a new place not long before this, where one afternoon I'm laying on the couch and sleep overtakes me. So there I am in a house, and I'm kind of looking around because I'm excited by the prospect of moving into a new place. The entire time, the real estate agent is just outside of my peripherals, and as I finally go to ask a question after being satisfied with the tour, the gentleman answers his phone and says, "Hold on, I'll be right back," and I never see this man's face, only the back of his head and a white button down with the sleeves rolled up. I'm waiting for the real estate agent to come back so I can ask him the question that I was going to ask when I start perusing the layout of this house that I find myself in. It was normal, one could assume at first, until I realized the stairway shouldn't be in the middle of the kitchen, going up, bisecting the walkway between the kitchen and the foyer. So now I'm asking myself, well, where the hell is the living room supposed to be? And I go looking for the living room and instead find myself down this hallway. In the hallway, things feel off. Probably because of the fact that there was a red glow tinting the entire hallway. I'm curious enough to start walking down and looking into the rooms. The first room that I walk into has all of the stuff to indicate that this is the room of a young boy, with the race car bed frame and the toy box and everything. Which was curious to me because this house was supposed to be vacant. Every other part of the house that I had seen thus far was vacant. So I'm curious and notice that there is something underneath the covers. And when I pull it back, there's nothing. Even though I could have assumed that there was the giggle of a young child right before I pulled the covers back. So I walk out of the room, close the door, go down the hallway, and walk into the next. Entering the next room, there's nothing in it other than a small bed and a box TV sitting in the middle of the space against the wall. I've been here before. When I was a child, there was another dream that I had where I'm sitting in that bed and I'm watching that TV, and somehow I get pulled into the TV, and before remembering the rest of that dream, I get pulled into the TV once again. And what I'm seeing is sort of like a avant-garde black and white Power Rangers, which makes a whole lot of sense because I myself have a bit of a nostalgic place in my heart for the Power Rangers. And it was not surprising seeing the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, since I've got the first 2 seasons on DVD. As I'm watching, the landscape of the Power Rangers setting is wrong. Normally it's set up like a cheap costume kaiju battle, but this time there's a whole darkened cityscape, sort of like some paintings of New York. Very vague, very distant, desolate. And it almost looks like there's snow, but instead of snow, it's ash. And as the Power Rangers are trying to fight whatever monster that I'm assuming Rita Repulsa had sent their way, we zoom in to the actual city where there is a person walking past a storefront where there are TVs on display. And the person looks to see what I was seeing on my TV, and this jerks me back away, and I'm back in the room where I had started off in when I went into this room. Being startled and jarred, I promptly leave this room. Now I find myself in the hallway once again, where I look back down the hall to the dismally red glow. That now that I'm looking at it, it appears that the hallway is at a 90-degree angle before another hallway, and the red glow is actually coming from whatever's down around the corner. So I take a moment to slowly walk gently my way down to the hallway to look, and I see a ruckus, a hubbub. So I go down to see what the fuss is about, and I walk into an auditorium where there is a, best I can say it is that it was a Slipknot cover band who was cosplaying as Slipknot, performing a Slipknot song that, for the life of me, I can't remember right now. But as I realize I'm coming onto stage right, I'm looking around and seeing we're in an auditorium, not too different that you would see on a college campus. And forgetting everything that had just happened and where I had just come from, I think, ooh, this auditorium looks familiar. I think I've been to this college before. So I find a way to get down without interrupting the show and walk my way up the stairs toward the rest of wherever I am. When I leave the auditorium, I realize that this very much is a place that I have been to before. I'm walking out, and off to the side there's an attendance window and a bookstore, or the place where you collect your textbooks for the school year. This is all along my left side, and along my right side is a cafeteria where there really isn't anybody there, except for a couple of people coming and going. And where they are leaving to is a bus stop. And although there is a several paned glass wall with a few doors opening the way to the bus stop, other than the sidewalk and the buses, there's nothing out there. So I decide to find my way across the cafeteria, finding a set of stairs, find my way up, and of course, this is where the library is. I've been here before. I should have known this was going to bring me to the library. And as I am walking up into the library, it is now sort of at the same angle as the bus stop. Rather, I should say that the angle shows me a little bit overhead the bus stop. But the rest of it is still definitely a library. So I go look out, and again, another open pane glass wall that shows us a lakefront of some sort. Maybe it's not a lakefront, but there's a whole lot of mist and a whole lot of water. I definitely see the beach from where I'm standing. The sand is clear as day. And there's not really anybody going out there, even though there's a sidewalk and a gazebo. And then something unnerves me, and I start to come to the realization I've been here in dreams before. That's why I recognize this place. I've been to this place in dreams before. Oh, I'm dreaming. Which means I need to get back as soon as possible. If I'm going to wake up, oh boy. So I start running all the way back the way I came, down into the auditorium, up onto the stage right, was it left or right, whichever, going down, back down the hallway, down to the red tinted hallway, and all of the doors and all of the rooms are still the same, but now I've got to dodge 3 identical triplets who apparently burst their way out of the door as I'm trying to make my way back. I make it to the front door, open it, swing it open, and there's nothing but grass, openness, and nothing. And then I'm awake. Now, even though I didn't become lucid until closer to the end of the dream, it was still vivid enough for me to remember, clear as day, right here and right now, almost 2 years later. So I chalked it up as nothing more than a dream, until one day, I'm driving around with my significant other, and I've never been to this part of town before. We had enough money to throw into the tank and just joyride. So we're driving down into a town and into a place that I had never been before. And then we pass a college campus. Small college, like a community college. And as we drive past it, I look, slow down, hit the turn signal, turn into the parking lot, park so I can look straight at it. And I go, that's the place from my dreams. And as I sit there, because I had no indication toward my significant other what the hell was going on, so I start explaining it. And now I'm describing the sides of the building that I cannot see because I am staring at the open glass pane that has the cafeteria, and it has the library off to the side, which I can see the exact chair that I have had so much familiarity sitting in. I've been there before, in my dreams. And what was behind me was an incredibly large river. And I realized that I was walking distance from the place my car was parked to the gazebo that I had seen before. And as I'm describing the building, we then decide to drive around it. And my significant other is seeing that I described exactly where the cafeteria meets the bus stop, and the buses all lined up exactly where they're supposed to be. What the fuck? In that moment, my mind was entirely blown because what I was facing, literally and figuratively, defied all logic and rationale that I could come up with. Now, don't get me wrong, I had been to places in dreams that did seem to exist, but they were all places that I had been to before, such as shopping malls that I frequented as a child, or houses that I had been around and inside of previously. Those places existed, but I had a frame of reference in my mind for them. This was different, because there I was, seeing the physical brick and mortar structure of a place that I had only ever been to in dreams. Now, from what I can tell, and I admit, as I already said, I don't know a whole hell of a lot about the psychological and the scientific explanation of dreams. But from what I had believed previously, dreams are our subconscious working things out. Dreams can be a way to interpret things going on in our mind that we might not be consciously aware of. Dreams could be a way to extract deeper meaning on some sort of level, but it all has something to do with us, our experience as individuals, and the things that we have been through or are going through. And even if we want to lean more of a mystical or magical route, the idea that spirits and deities can enter your dreams to some extent, this still would then suggest that the thing of a spiritual nature is then entering your dream that is already taking place. This was different. How had I been to a place in my dreams that I had never been to before in a town that I've never traveled to? Everything was foreign. Everything was new to me on that particular joyriding car trip that we happened to take and just let fate take the wheel, metaphorically, not literally. We just drove and wound up in a place not too far from where we are now, but at the same time, I had never been there before. I had never seen that building before. And it was in my dreams. Now, again, I don't know. I can only best come to a theory, a postulation, a suggestion. And if you're familiar with my content on TikTok, this is a magical mad science theory. And as I've been trying to do this whole time, let's use Sandman as the jumping point. You disappoint me, Corinthian. You and these humans you inspired and created disappoint me. You were my masterpiece, or so I thought. A nightmare created to be the darkness and the fear of darkness in every human heart. A black mirror made to reflect everything about itself that humanity will not confront. But look at you. 40 years walking the earth, honing yourself, infecting others with your joy of death. And what have you given them? What have you wrought, Corinthian? Nothing. Just something else for people to be scared of. That's all. You've told them that there are bad people out there, and they've known that all along. This is what Dream tells the Corinthian when he finally confronts him at the cereal convention, confronting him over the fact that he's misused his power and has appropriated his own purpose for what he was created for, because instead of being of use and benefit to mankind, all the Corinthian has done is inspire people to kill one another. However, as a magician, there is something very interesting that piqued my interest that Dream tells the Corinthian, which is that he's supposed to be a black mirror. Let's talk about black mirrors. Now, courtesy of modern convention as well as financial limitation, people have gotten much more comfortable in making their own black mirrors at home, typically either with some kind of paint, spray paint, and putting it underneath a reflective surface, because this is all that's really necessary for a black mirror to work. And it usually is a lot more cost-effective doing it this way than going a more old-school route and spending the money on getting a black obsidian mirror. Obsidian is a volcanic glass, typically something that happens when magma is super cooled when it is introduced to a body of water. Although there are other ways to create obsidian, this is usually what is indicated when you stumble onto a bunch of black obsidian naturally. Now, obsidian does also come in more jagged chips and chunks that look something like this. However, when obsidian is taken care of, nicely polished, it can have a nice and reflective surface, even to such a point that you can see my face in the reflection from the other side of the camera. Now, obsidian has been used for a long time for multiple different divinatory practices, oftentimes coming in the form of a crystal ball like this one, where people scry to communicate with spirits or delve deep into their own psyche, or perhaps even do a bit of fortune telling. But there's something special about the flat, even surface of the obsidian mirror. Now, obsidian mirrors have been modernly and contemporarily used for a type of divination that allows one to be able to communicate with spirits, very much akin to a form of mediumship. But another way that obsidian mirrors get used is to plumb the depths of one's own subconscious in something that is very famously referred to as shadow work. Now, in spite of the recent popularity in regards to the topic of shadow work in online occult, spiritual, and magical spaces, it winds up being a contentious topic because there are a lot of people that will scream from the top of their lungs, you need to do shadow work if you want to do anything spiritual or magical. And then there are those of us who are in the camp, like myself, that suggests you don't need to do shadow work just to start doing something. And I think a lot of this is a result of shadow work getting carried away from its source material. So let's talk about Carl Gustav Jung, Swiss psychoanalyst and forefather of modern psychoanalysis. We have the concept of shadow work courtesy of the concept of the shadow self, which is something that Carl Jung talked about a whole heck of a lot. Now again, I am an armchair psychologist at best. I am not a reliable source of information when it comes to this topic, because it's always going to be skewed with my own bias and the ways that I have come to understand these things. That being said, I'm going to do my best. First and foremost, the shadow self, your shadow self, is you. But it's the parts of you that you don't wind up looking at. It's the parts of you that sort of navigate the way that you go about the world, whether you're conscious of it or not. And the way that this is explained is that throughout our lives, we are being monitored, policed, reprimanded, encouraged, rewarded. And by these interpersonal relationships and the feedback of our peers as well as the world around us, there are some things that we grow to prosper within ourselves, and there are other things that we do our goddamnedest never sees the light of day. And those things that we shove down are still a part of us, but they become a part of the shadow self. I want to use myself as an example. When I was a child, I was bullied in school. And a lot of the things that I was bullied for, I wound up noticing it in other people. And although I didn't go out of my way to correct the behavior or the mannerisms of others, I still made sure to not also look or act like the other people that were in my sort of clique, if you will, that got them bullied and got me bullied. And I noticed it amongst us, and I said, well, I'm not going to do these things anymore. This, for me, came out of a sense of self-preservation. I had to go to school, I couldn't get out of it, and I had to continue to go to school and face the bullies that were making my school life utter and total misery. So I took it upon myself to refuse acting upon the things that got me bullied. Now, this doesn't only happen in school settings where we get bullied, but when we do something and get either positive or negative feedback, those are the things that we are going to internalize as good and bad behaviors. And when some of the things that we get punished for or ridiculed for, and those things aren't fair to be ridiculed for, there's a lot of stuff that gets pushed down that it's not fair that it got pushed down. And oftentimes the reason it stays in the shadow is because of the trauma that we endure that makes it stay there. There was a quote by Carl Jung that I'm going to wind up paraphrasing because I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it was something to the nature of, one will go throughout their life believing that they are being dictated by fate or a supernatural force, when in reality it is their shadow self that is bringing them to the things that they are dealing with. And that's because when we don't face these things and we don't confront these things and try to find a way to integrate the parts of the shadow self into the whole, well, we're gonna wind up doing shit that we don't understand because we have never taken the time to fucking look at it. In other words, shadow work is therapy, and sometimes it includes trauma work. And not everybody is certified to be therapizing themselves. If you don't know what you're going into, and you don't know what you're doing, you can definitely wind up making the entire situation worse. And this is why I say, if you want to do shadow work, go ahead and do it. Don't let others tell you that you need to, because odds are they are not a licensed, trained professional. And even if they are, they're probably not your licensed, trained professional. So with all of that being said about shadow work, I guess the question is now, how the hell does this thing help us with shadow work? A black mirror? Really? Well, I guess so, yeah, let's talk about it. The black mirror itself is only going to ever reflect what's in the surface of the mirror. It's not what you see in the mirror itself. It's that by looking at the black reflective surface, looking at it at a slightly distorted image of yourself, this has the potentiality of putting one in a trance-like state. The mirror is not going to show you anything, but by looking into the mirror, you are now in this altered state of consciousness where you're now able to reflect inward. And it's theorized, posited, that because it is a black darkened surface, that we then look at the black or darkened or shadowy parts of ourself while we are in this trance-like state that has been induced by staring into the black mirror. Along the mystical, magical schools of thought, it is not what you see in the mirror. It is what is now conjured into your mind's eye. It's not supernatural, it's not paranormal, but you wind up peering into your shadow self. You wind up confronting the things in you and about you that you wind up not liking to face. The things that we've told ourselves forever that, no, that's not me, that doesn't exist. Or the things that the bad thing happened when we were younger and we refuse to look at it. That then will pop up when we are doing shadow work via black mirror. And for a lot of us, maybe not all of us, but for many people, it will play out like a daydream, or perhaps something between a dream and a daydream. It'll feel a lot like, sort of like your imagination, while at the same time having a dreamlike quality. And this is why you should do it sparingly, because if you do it too much, well, let's just say it's hard to stop doing that when you're in the constant habit of doing it. So now, when Morpheus, Dream of the Endless, in this book, goes ahead and looks at the Corinthian and says, "A nightmare I created to be the darkness and the fear of darkness in every human heart. A black mirror made to reflect everything about itself that humanity will not confront." Oh boy, it made perfect sense to me because of all the shit I already knew about black mirrors and shadow work. But what does this have to do with dreams? Where do dreams actually come into all of this? Why would a nightmare created by the King of Dreams be a worldwide human black mirror? How would one do that? To help me with this portion of the video, I'm going to utilize some clips from another video made by one of my favorite content creators, Max Derrat. In this video, he's talking about how Jungian psychology helps make sense of the movie The Shining, and had I not watched this video myself, I wouldn't have this theory at all. So I'm going to suggest you go watch the original, that way I'm not just haphazardly stealing clips from somebody else. Well, let's start with the hypnagogic state.
2/3 of our lives, we are in a conscious state, going about our daily activities. For the other third, we are in an unconscious state, sleeping and dreaming. What many people are unaware of is a third state, called a hypnagogic state. Think of this state as the borderline between consciousness and unconsciousness, between being awake and sleeping. When one is in a hypnagogic state, one might experience hallucinations. What one might normally see in one's dreams begins to bleed into your conscious state.
Have you ever had one of those times where you're laying down, starting to drift off for sleep, and suddenly you're aware that you're in a dream, and you can kind of interact lucidly, but for the most part it's still just a dream and you're kind of watching it more than you're interacting with it right before you actually pass the rest of the way out? Or how about on the other side of that, when we are starting to wake up and we start to become conscious of the fact that we are dreaming, and maybe at this point we can become a little bit lucid, but maybe not to the extent that the internet would have you think lucidity in a dream would be right before you wake up. This is the hypnagogic state. Hypnagogia is also an altered state of consciousness that can be induced through a trance-like state achieved via meditation. And that is exactly what I think is going on when we use the obsidian mirror in order to scry and dig into our own subconscious in order to do some kind of shadow work. Now, there is a caveat with using this that I think is important to bring up here. If left too long in the hypnagogic state, this can allow for your subconscious to start seeping into your waking mind in the form of delusions and hallucinations. And this isn't spiritual or metaphysical. This is literally how this works. If you leave yourself in the hypnagogic state while you are awake for too long, such as through trance-like states, meditation, or scrying mirrors, you can start to hallucinate from this. Now, when I first really started learning about and trying to understand the concept of hypnagogia and hypnagogic states, it made me think of other forms of divination other than the obsidian scrying mirror. Think about a Rorschach test, otherwise known as an ink blot test. This is usually a test that is administered by a trained licensed psychologist or psychotherapist, where it's just ink blots that are put onto a piece of paper, folded in half so it would be even, and then there's nothing there. It's just an ink blot. But by what the patient, the client, is now seeing and the shapes that are formed within that particular ink blot, that is what is reflecting back to that client. And that client now can be a little bit deciphered by the licensed trained professional in order to understand them more deeply and in a more intimately psychological way. Riddle me this. Where does that sound awfully familiar from? Well, tarot cards, actually. Think about it this way. You have a deck of tarot cards and you're intending to do some kind of reading to divine some sort of mystical interpretation. But these are just cards. These cards also have a set defined meaning that represent something or a number of different things. And based on the meaning of the card and the placement of the cards on the spread for the reading, we're able to decipher a deeper meaning from that placement of cards and what cards are drawn. But what if it works just a little bit differently? All of this is still accurate to some extent, but what if the cards that we draw actually work a lot more like a Rorschach test, where because of the way that they mean something, they represent some kind of archetype or some kind of theme. With that, we, as the readers, decipher something from our own subconscious, and it is the cards in the tarot that are helping us to figure that out. By having a series of cards with set interpretations that could mean multiple different things, it is our minds peering into the subconscious that this deck of cards is helping us to decipher. This might also make sense of why some people will suggest that different tarot cards have a different personality of their own. Because with that being said, everything I've already laid down, if the tarot cards are acting more like a Rorschach test or obsidian mirror, then what is being reflected to us as the means through which we are deciphering some deeper meaning would also have an effect. If I'm using this particular deck of tarot cards, there's a lot of different color. There's a lot of vibrant and deliberately crafted artistry on this card. Any card that's in this deck is like that, and it translates something to us by the way each thing is deliberately illustrated to give us something to think about. To drive home my point, let's look at the same card from two different decks. The Star card. This one over here is much more colorful and vibrant, and with the colors that are being used being more shades of purple and blue, that means something to us the way that we're going to pick up on it. We also have a very brightly lit and colorized star at the top of whatever deity is there. I believe it's Sopdet, actually, the Sirius star interpretation of Iset, aka Isis. Back to the point. This one, however, is dark. It's in black and white. It's dreary. Even though this is supposed to be a card that represents hope and something to look forward to, it still has a vague feeling of something that you would see in the illustrations of... Ooh, what was the artist's name? Alvin Schwartzman? The guy that did the art for the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And now I know for myself personally that because that's a part of my childhood, that's going to give this a glimmer of something dark and spooky no matter what card I draw. As opposed to this one, where it definitely has a clear representation of what it's supposed to mean. Although there are other stars in the sky, there's the one right there. And in a symbolization akin to the sign of Aquarius, from two hands, the figure in the center is pouring water from two different pitchers in order to represent rebirth and renewal. And even though something similar is going on in this one, by the way it's colorized, it's got an attitude of its own. And based on whoever is reading it is going to have a different interpretation based on what we are looking at. And based on who is looking at it. Tarot and Oracle and other similar types of divination basically work like a Rorschach test, where we are seeing something, looking at it, and based on our experience and our biases, it draws something out of our subconscious by having a set meaning, and of those meanings, we then interpretate. Interpretate? I'm leaving it in. Something from the cards. But really what it is we are using the cards as a way to help us figure something out. Cards are just cards. However, I think this is also an important time to note that this is also probably why it's not a good idea to constantly look at the world around you and interpret signs wherever you go. In a lot of occult and spiritual circles, it's very commonplace for people to see a crow or an eagle flying overhead, or when they look at the clock at just the right time, based on the pattern of numbers that are on the clock, it means something and interprets something. But if we go around seeing everything as some kind of sign, this could also wind up having incredibly frustrating, if not dangerous, implications if we do this on the regular. Because now we have turned the entire world around us into some kind of Rorschach test. And now everything around us is reflecting something back to us to dig further into our own minds and our own subconscious, and via some backdoor hypnagogic state, pull that more forward out of the unconscious mind into the conscious mind. And as already stated, doing this too much can start to cause hallucinations and even, in some instances, delusional thinking and ideation. Which is why it's best not to do this with everything, and to always stay grounded when we take the time to sit down and do some kind of divination. Because even if you do believe that there is something mystical or magical about it, it's in the very least just as much psychological. Now, the connection between the subconscious and divination doesn't end there. Let's take a look at one of my favorite divinatory tools, which is also, personally for me, where this all started. The Ouija board. The Ouija board, quite literally, is nothing special or fancy. It's a plank, a board, where the alphabet is lined up on it. We've got a 1 through 9, including 0, goodbye, yes, and no. That's it. The design on whatever board you're looking at is a matter of aesthetic preference. It's just a plank of wood. It's just... that one's probably particle board. Beside the point. It's just a board with numbers and letters on it, and the brand name. But a lot of people have come to the conclusion that the way that these things work is by something referred to as the ideomotor effect. There was a couple of years ago on TikTok, particularly the witchy side of TikTok, where people would take either a key or a stone or something in their hand, and they would go like this and try to get it to roll off their hand. And a lot of people got it to work. But it's not magic. It's the ideomotor effect. An idea that suggests and points toward the phenomenon that our subconscious is connected to our physical bodies. And because of this, when we are doing things such as trying to roll a key off of our hand or utilizing a planchette to scoot around a Ouija board to get spelled out communications from something or another, it's courtesy of subconscious physical twitches and muscle spasms, and basically, with the Ouija board, you're actually communicating with your subconscious. Which is why I think a lot of people believe, in some instances, that the Ouija board is so fucking terrifying, and people wind up having such interesting and outlandish experiences is because they're basically using it like a black mirror. And now the things that are rooting around in there are making them look at the parts of themselves that they don't want to look at. If somebody is of a Christian orientation and has a deliberate fear of the devil, what do you think's going to happen if they're a little bit afraid of the Ouija board, go to try it out? It's not a far cry to suggest that one of these spirits would then tell you that they are the devil or that they are Lucifer. Our own fears are coming out, or we are now confronting our own inner desires or our shadow self, the things that we keep locked down in a way that we don't want to look at and convince ourselves aren't there. I think that's more of what's going on with the Ouija board, and when we are confronted with some of these darker parts of ourself, it appears to have a mind of its own and scares the shit out of a lot of people. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that there is nothing mystical or magical about any of these things. I am in fact an avid and staunch believer in the supernatural and the paranormal, but I also believe that it's important to debunk things first, to put the mundane before the magic. And if we go around thinking that everything that moves is something spiritual or something spooky, where does that actually leave us? Where does it lead us? Nowhere comfy that I can think of, other than having a life that is now full of mystical and wonderful, fantastical experiences. And honestly, I can't deny that there is an appeal to that. But let's talk a little bit about the collective unconscious, referring back to the Max Derrat video, where he talks about it in ways that I don't think that I could articulate nearly as well.
The collective unconscious. Here's a definition. Quote, Jung's theory on the collective unconscious was that it is made up of a collection of knowledge and imagery that every person is born with and is shared by all human beings due to ancestral experience. Although individuals do not know what thoughts and images are in their collective unconscious, it is thought that in moments of crisis, the psyche can tap into the collective unconscious. As for what is in the collective unconscious, Jung believed that it is made up of instincts and archetypes that manifest basic and fundamental pre-existing images, symbols, or forms which are repressed by the conscious mind.
So there we go. Courtesy of millions of years of evolution and your ancestors surviving, and because of their survival, you are here now. There seems to be a collective unconscious of things that are a part of the human experience that sort of help us find patterns in inexplicable things that are also a part of the human psyche as a whole. And there are a number of people, including Carl Jung himself, that jumped off of this idea and posited that this is exactly why certain things that play out in story structure or TV and media of all sorts, certain mythologies, are thematic. And some story structures are satisfying when they meet certain beats. And this is all because of the archetypes, or the overarching nebulous glob of this type of character and this type of story and this type of villain and this type of hero. These are archetypes. And I think this also goes pretty much in line with what I was saying about the tarot. These are similar shapes that can be applied to any number of situations, and to that extent we can also include the zodiac. The zodiac represents some kind of personality traits as well when we're talking about astrology, and it's easy enough to suggest, oh, you're such a Scorpio, or perfect Aries insinuations, when these are the archetypes of very broad swooping strokes of archetypal personality construction. And it's easy enough to cling onto something that feels like it represents the way that we understand ourselves. It's not too difficult to do when the descriptions are as vague as possible. Now let me explain what I mean. Not too long ago, but still too long ago, on here, I made a video called IDGAF number 1. And in that, I'm talking about how it doesn't surprise me that people wind up taking all kinds of BuzzFeed quizzes, or Once Upon a Time It Was My Yearbook, and people wind up clinging to their zodiac signs as well as their Myers-Briggs personality test results. Because those things help us figure ourselves out in some way. It's easy enough to have an archetype that represents a map for you to understand you. And I don't think this is any different when it comes to a full, laid out and explained birth chart when we're talking about astrology on a bigger scale, and we're talking about a person's big three, the sun, moon, and ascendant, when we're also incorporating what the placement of this particular planet means, and the difference between the north node, south node, and midheaven, and oh my goodness. Now they are taking these vague archetypes and putting them together in a sort of mishmash of now perfectly honed in explanations of a person. But even if it seems like it's more and more meticulous, it doesn't stop being abundantly vague. You could take any of them and they could apply to anybody. But it's satisfying because it's archetypal to the human experience, and we also just like to hold on to things that help us navigate the world around us. And I don't want to take that away from anybody. But at the same time, is it helping you? Are these maps, these personality profiles helping you to navigate the world? Or are they the thing that's navigating you? Are you seeing what I'm getting at here? When we put more of the emphasis on external factors, we're no longer in control or having agency of the things that we're doing. The more this, that, and the other that we put our faith into, we wind up removing ourselves from the grounded, practical reality of the physical world around us, and it almost is like it makes a dream around us. And instead of living in the real world, entertaining dreams only sometimes for a third of the time that we're living or a third of the time that we're awake, there's a balance. And when that balance is imbalanced, it has some interesting consequences. But there's something that interests me that was said in the Sandman TV show. Let's go take a look at that.
You don't care about humanity. You only care about yourself and your realm and your rules.
I contain the entire collective unconscious.
I contain the entire collective unconscious. Does this then mean that via through the collective unconscious explains how I wound up in a dream at a place that I'd never been to before, only later to realize that place actually exists? Maybe. There's a part of me that would love to believe that, and honestly, as unhinged as it might sound, I'm not going to rule it out. But what else does it tell us about dream? From everything that we've said so far in this video, in spite of how long it's taken us to get here, he's not only the embodiment of dreams, but he is the embodiment of stories. The concept of dreams is everything that he is. So when it comes to particular blueprints in storytelling, a lot of these stories wind up fitting certain archetypes, or they are meaningful to us because they are subversions of the plain and mapped out expectations that are in line with these archetypal storytelling patterns. Or we take something that we're all familiar with, open it up with a meta-narrative, or placing yourself as a self-insert to explore the story that you've created. That way you can find a way to experience it yourself. It's all a part of what dream is and what dream does. He tells stories, and he encourages the dreams that we hold true about ourselves, that give us hope and give us something to aspire to, the things that inspire us, the things that get us going in the morning when we wake up and don't know why the fuck we're getting out of bed. This is why dreams are important, because dreams literally are amongst the ways that we relate to one another. Whether you can or cannot dream when you lay your head down at night, or you can't remember your dreams, the concept and the idea of dreams, courtesy of daydream, storytelling, immersing ourselves in a story, learning about the mythology, or hell, even learning about the past, archaeologically or historically, it doesn't matter. You're going to have the fantasy in your head that you're constructing for yourself to learn about it, but you're never going to know because you weren't there. The things that we entertain ourselves with also become the dreams that we entertain. And that is why the Dream Lord also contains the entire collective unconscious. And that's what Sandman does. Invites us to look at what it means and what exactly it is to dream. And yet, in spite of how important dreams are and how magnificent and wonderful they can be, or how dreadful they can be and terrifying when we lose the hope in the dream and it becomes a nightmare, to quote Bill and Ted, the only place to be is here, and the only time to be is now. Dreams inspire us, and they help us to aspire to something. And it is through dreams that we're able to entertain one another. But what are those dreams doing for us, other than entertaining us, if we don't take the time to wake up, at least every now and then? Do you understand what it is that I've invited you to do? To explore the importance of dreams. Well, yes, but why? Well, knowing me, it's not difficult to assume that I'd wind up talking about it, and then in doing so, I'd be inviting others to explore the importance of dreams. Do you think yourself simply a pawn in my own schemes? Quite frankly, you wouldn't be the first to treat me as such. Then allow me to ask you this. Do you know what main character syndrome is? I've always considered it to be when somebody believes that they are the main character of other people's stories, or in the very least, they wind up acting as such. And why would you suggest this phenomenon is so rampant? Well, in an oversimplification, people don't feel important, so they wind up constructing their own personal narratives where they can believe that they are important. And what do you suppose would happen if people realized they already were important without needing to subjugate others to their own delusions? Well, I suppose it would wind up happening much less. When was the first time you saw yourself in a main character? Blade of Heaven, the character Soma. So much so that your character Jekyll was based on Soma and yourself in a fantasy setting. I mean, well, you're not wrong, but Jekyll isn't me. Jekyll is a character. Correct. But when you play that character, aren't you exercising something that already exists within yourself? And weren't you exactly that just for Neil Gaiman? It's a little more complicated than that. But ask yourself, is Jekyll nothing more than a Dungeons & Dragons character? Well, no. Jekyll is also the mascot for my social media, as well as a completely separate social media persona. So isn't it self-evident that Jekyll is much more than a self-insert role-playing character? So you're suggesting that you are much more than Neil Gaiman's self-insert to explore the world of storytelling. Am I not here with you in this video? Yes, but you're my interpretation for my video. And Alan Moore didn't write John Constantine when he appeared in the Sandman comics. Does that mean that he was not John Constantine? Okay, you got me. Oh? And how so? Look, in real life, I'm reading from a script. A script that when I was writing it, it didn't feel like anything other than writing down a conversation. In other words, I didn't come up with your parts. They just sort of came to me. Furthermore, if I get too meta with this, then it's going to open up a potential endless labyrinth of questions. Questions such as, was Tom Sturgis portraying literally you in the Netflix adaptation? And if so, at what point does the show have to get too carried away from the source material before it becomes a completely separate you? And even then, I still am wondering what the hell you are. Am I entertaining my own imagination? Am I engaging with an internalized version of you in my own subconscious? Or am I actually interacting with a fictional character? And I get that oftentimes the point of meta-narratives is to invite the audience to look deeper on certain things and consider different perspectives and perhaps even dig deeper into themselves to find some sort of deeper meaning with their own subconscious. But that being said, what does it say about me in this instance where I, the author, can't even tell what you are? So you're beginning to understand. Understand what? What dream of the endless actually entails. That your very existence is supposed to point out the endless nature of the concept in which you embody, and that is dreams. Then I suppose the only thing left to do is to wake up. I'm sorry, do what now? Huh. Well, that's not at all how that was supposed to end.